On the outskirts of medieval Dublin, where the River Liffey meets the cold depths of Dublin Bay, lies a street with a grim name and a dark history. Today, Misery Hill and the Grand Canal Dock area of Dublin are home to a vibrant and modern community consisting of luxury apartments, cafes, bars and a theatre. But in the medieval period, this was a desolate place, set apart from Dublin City, which at that time lay farther upstream on the River Liffey. Despite all the changes that have taken place here, a street name survives outside the door of a 5-star hotel that commemorates the wretched suffering of generations of Dubliners past. Misery Hill recalls in its name not just one, but rather two tales of misery, and in this video we will delve into the city's distant past to tell the story of the most miserable street in Dublin and follow in the footsteps of those who spent their last hours here. Before we get going, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to learn more about the historic city of Dublin. Misery Hill is now a short street in a wealthy inner-city development on the south bank of the River Liffey between the city centre and Rings End. To understand the origin of this curious street name, we need to travel back to 13th century Dublin, and a time when the city was centred around Dublin Castle, and much of what we consider to be the city centre today were open fields and a marshy estuary. The River Liffey that we know today has utterly changed from the river our ancestors were familiar with. When the first Viking longboats sailed up the river in the 9th century, they found a much wider river with banks full of inlets and reeds. The tidal and salty waters of the Liffey reached out to Townsend Street and almost lapped against the walls of Trinity College after its construction in the 1500s. Many of the Liffey's tributaries, such as the Bradog and the Stein, that have now disappeared underground and been forgotten, were still visible and well known by the inhabitants of Dublin. The most important of these tributaries was the Poddle River that provided the Vikings with fresh water. The Liffey waters are too salty to drink this far downstream, and a deep pool that acted as a natural harbour to anchor their longboats. This pool of water, named Dove Linn in Irish, meaning Black Pool, would give Dublin its modern name and is the reason the Vikings founded the city in this location. The Poddle still flows under Dublin Castle and meets the River Liffey close to Millennium Bridge, but is culverted for much of its course now, and the site of the Black Pool can be found at Dove Linn Gardens in the grounds of Dublin Castle. The Viking settlement of Dublin was centred around Wood Quay, and following the Norman invasion of the 1100s, Dublin Castle was constructed slightly to the south of this settlement. By the 13th century, Dublin had become a walled medieval city, and little development had taken place downstream and to the east, where Misery Hill is situated. Much of the land past Misery Hill had not yet been reclaimed from the Liffey estuary and the sea, and Rings End was an area of tidal mudflats used to anchor ships. Misery Hill was very much a place set apart from the city, and if you stand at the end of Sir John Rogerson's Quay at the entrance to the Grand Canal docks, there is still a feeling to this day that you have reached the end of the city boundaries. This isolated location will play an important role in the story that is about to unfold. By the 12th century, a strange and terrifying new illness had become prevalent in Dublin City that would not only leave a mark on its unfortunate victims, but also on the history and street names of Dublin. Leprosy struck fear into the hearts of medieval Dubliners, who knew that if contracted, the victim would be sentenced to a life of cruel exile from their community and a body ravaged by disfigurement and possible blindness. Although there was no cure for leprosy, hospitals were established to try and provide some respite for those afflicted by the disease. In reality, there was little they could do to help, other than try to provide some comfort to those who could afford it. The Chapel of St. Stephen was founded around 1230 AD on what is now Stephen Street and would quickly be converted to a leper hospital. Its location outside the city walls was deemed to be far away enough from the general population to avoid any further spread of the disease. The leper hospital and chapel would give its name to what is now the most famous park in central Dublin, St Stephen's Green. The chapel and surrounding buildings can be seen on John Speed's map of Dublin, drawn in 1610. Today, the site of the Leper Hospital is occupied by the Mercer Medical Centre on Stephen Street. Another hospital existed close to the junction of Townsend Street and Hawkins Street, called the Hospital of St James, and was founded around 1216 AD. The hospitals were known at the time as Lazar houses, and by looking at old maps of Dublin, we can see that Townsend Street was once called Lazar's Hill. The Lazar can be interpreted as either an alternative to leper, or more probably it came from Saint Lazarus, who was the patron saint of lepers. Irish street signs often give us an insight to the original place names before they were altered or anglicised to their modern form. As Irish is the official first language of the state, it is always included on official street signs. Taking a close look at a sign on the rear of Pearse Street Garda Station, the Irish translation of Townsend Street is given as Shroyd Canuck Lower, meaning Leper's Hill Street, and not the very literal but rather apt Townsend, or end of the town street. Similarly, a street that runs parallel to Misery Hill is named Laser Lane in English, but the Irish name of Lona na Lower translates of Lane of the Lepers. The Hospital of St James provided its patients with a safe place to rest and receive some care, but was more akin to a hospice than a hospital. For many of the patients that arrived there, it was a stopping point on a much longer journey of pilgrimage, and those who could afford it were well looked after. Many poor unfortunates, however, due to lack of money or room, were unable to gain access to St James's and had no other choice but to keep walking along Leprous Hill to the outskirts of the city. Continuing straight on what is now Hanover Street would bring them to what for many would be their final destination. The route that these people were following was part of a pilgrimage that is still undertaken by thousands of people every year. The Camino de Santiago has long links with Dublin, and particularly with an area that is now associated with Ireland's most famous drink. Long before the Guinness Brewery was established, St James's Gate was an entry gate into the walled medieval city of Dublin, and was located at the junction of Thomas Street and Watling Street. The gate, sadly demolished in 1734, was the starting point of the Camino, and was undertaken by hundreds of people who contracted leprosy as a desperate search for a miracle cure in Santiago de Compostela, Spain, and the shrine of the Apostle James. Taking this walk through Dublin to reach the ships waiting on the Liffey at Townsend Street and Misery Hill that would bring them to the north coast of Spain was a daunting task. The fear of leprosy and the people who suffered from it was great among the residents of the city. They were shunned by their family and friends, who, terrified of catching it themselves, believed they, although still alive, were serving their time in purgatory on earth before moving on to the next life. These days we know that leprosy is not particularly contagious, but place yourself in the shoes of a pilgrim beginning their walk from St James's Gate, accompanied by a steward ringing a bell and shouting "Unclean, unclean," while another held a 40-foot long pole to ensure a safe distance was kept at all times. Suffering the debilitating effects of their affliction, the pilgrims were humiliated further as they marched towards the banks of the River Liffey, and their friends and family looked on fearfully from a distance. For the poor unfortunates that were unable to gain access to the leper hospital of St James of Townsend Street, there was one more place they could go. Another hospital stood on a lonely hill on the banks of the River Liffey, but this was a ramshackle institution that offered little more than a place to get out of the rain, and quickly earned the name Misery Hill. Within sight of the hospital, ships would dock to transport the pilgrims to the coast of Spain. After a night's sleep at Misery Hill, the pilgrims walked from the hospital wearing ragged clothing and hoods to disguise their disfigurement, but their last vestige of hope was about to be quashed. The captain of the ship examined the hopeful passengers as they approached, but for those whom the disease had progressed too far, he often refused permission to board. He too was afraid and did not want to expose himself or his other passengers to their illness. So this is where your journey ends, on the cold and windy outskirts of Dublin. You cannot return home to the city, whose bells you can hear tolling in the distance, as you are now an outcast, and your former life is nothing more than a memory. Your last hours will be spent here on Misery Hill, living in exile and fear. To this day, you can begin your Camino walk in Dublin at St James's Gate and purchase your pilgrim's passport at St James's Church. Hopefully, if you do undertake the journey from here, you will not be followed by a man ringing a bell and another prodding you with a long pole while shouting "unclean, unclean" as you walk past the Guinness storehouse. Incidentally, this is the origin of the phrase, "I wouldn't touch them with a 40-foot pole." This tale of two miseries would take another dark turn when, in a time before the bodies of those condemned to death on the gallows were sent to the operating theatres of Dublin for dissection, they were instead brought here to Misery Hill. A short distance from Misery Hill, and itself on the then outskirts of the city, stood Gallows Hill, where those condemned in the courts of Dublin met the hangman's noose. The most famous of the executions that took place on the spot is probably that of Dorcas Starkey Kelly, who, accused of witchcraft and murder, was partially hanged on Gallows Hill and subsequently burnt while still alive in 1761. For some of those who were executed on Gallows Hill, today called Baggot Street Lower, the final humiliation of a public execution would continue post-mortem. The city wished to make an additional example of those convicted of certain crimes, such as piracy, murder, and bigamy. The bodies of these unfortunates were cut down from the gallows and taken by cart to Misery Hill, where they were hanged in chains for up to a year to act as a deterrent to those considering a life of crime. One crime that was of particular concern to the authorities was that of piracy, and two men by the name of Gidley and McKinley would pay with their lives on Gallows Hill in 1766. As a ship named the Earl of Sandwich made its way from the Canary Islands to England in 1765, a dastardly plan of mutiny and murder was being hatched by several of its crew members, including ringleaders Peter McKinley and George Gidley. On board the ship was a fortune in Spanish silver and gold that belonged to a passenger named George Glass and his family, and the conspirators were planning to take it for themselves. As the ship passed the coast of Waterford, the men murdered George Glass, Captain Cochrane, and the rest of the crew, and threw Mrs. Glass and her 10-year-old daughter Kathleen overboard to freeze in the Irish Sea. They unloaded the gold and silver into a smaller boat, scuttled the ship, and made for land. The men buried some of their gold on a beach near Tramore and made their way to Dublin, thinking they had committed the perfect crime. Unfortunately for them, the ship soon washed up on the shore, alerting the authorities to the crime, and a manhunt began for the would-be pirates. While hiding out in the Black Bull Tavern on Dublin's Thomas Street, the men were captured and sentenced to death on Gallows Hill. Following their execution in 1766, the bodies were taken to Misery Hill, where they were strung up in chains and left as a warning to the sailors making their way up the River Liffey that pirates would meet a gruesome end. Another man who would find his corpse hanging on Misery Hill was one Edward Tyrrell, otherwise known as the Priest Hunter. Tyrrell had been hired by Joshua Dawson, the man who laid out Grafton Street, Dawson Street, and built the Mansion House as a home for his family, to hunt down Catholic priests. The Popery Act was passed by Parliament in 1704 with the aim of suppressing the Catholic faith and preventing the further growth of popery in Ireland, and will become one of the most notorious of many penal laws introduced by British authorities to crack down on the overwhelmingly Catholic population of Ireland. Tyrrell travelled around Ireland on the payroll of Dawson, searching for unregistered priests who were holding mass in secret locations to avoid the attention of the authorities. In one instance, Tyrrell set out to capture a priest in Wicklow named Edward Byrne in 1712, and despite raiding several houses, failed in his attempt, as he frequently did. Tyrrell was a much despised figure among the Catholic population of Ireland and had to travel with armed guards. On several occasions, his priest hunting ended up with him receiving a beating from angry locals. While all of this was going on, Tyrrell himself was a wanted man, as he had been convicted of bigamy a few years previously and was on the run from Newgate prison. Tyrrell was finally captured and executed for bigamy on Gallows Hill. His body was then taken to Misery Hill, where his corpse was put on public display. Over the next 300 years, the fortunes of Misery Hill would ebb and flow like the tidal river that passes it by. The biggest change to the area came in 1796 with the official opening of the Grand Canal docks, which at that time were the largest in the world, and connected the canal to the River Liffey. Within a relatively short time, the use of canal systems declined with the advent of the railways, and the area once again fell into disrepair. Gas companies, coal yards, tar pits, and iron foundries would gradually take over, and by the 1980s, the area was neglected and heavily polluted. During the 1980s, U2 opened a recording studio in this quiet part of town and recorded some of their most famous albums in a building that once stabled the working horses of the Grand Canal. It was not until the late 90s and early 2000s that a massive rejuvenation of the area took place, following a €50 million decontamination job, turning it into the fashionable neighbourhood and office district, sometimes referred to as Silicon Docks, that we know today. Misery Hill is unrecognisable today to those medieval Dubliners who spent their last hours here in pain and torment, but the street name has survived as a memorial to those who walked the streets of Dublin before us. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you would like to find out more about Dublin's fascinating past, be sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.